The agenda this week scanned the local media landscape, took the measure of Black History Month, looked at supportive employment and the safety of healthcare workers, and sought solutions for the skills gap. The agenda's week in review begins with Ontario's rise as a major hub for human trafficking. Look at this map that we're going to put up here. This is the 401 corridor. This is where the trafficking plays out a lot in our province. Highway, many of us drive all the time, Martin.
Yep.
Your team polices the southwest part of the GTA and Oakville. Where are these crimes on the 401 taking place?
I would say to you that the 401 is the main hub corridor for trafficking. I call it the virtual track because it's all behind closed doors. Every hotel and motel along that corridor will have trafficked victims in it at some point.
Every hotel and motel, and there are hundreds.
And I
of
would
them.
be confident in saying that to you, yes. And the same with the QEW. Our predominant area in Halton region is a QEW. So from Toronto right out to Niagara Falls, you know, you look at the hotels and motels along that corridor, and every single one of them will house trafficked victims at some point in time.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. We're not about like the sleazy motel. You're talking
Yes.
every hotel,
And
5-star, 3-star, 1-star, doesn't matter.
It knows no boundaries. In actual fact, there's been a real shift away from sleazy, budget, low-end motels towards your mainstream hotels that are out there, yeah, for sure.
Olivia, you have visited some of these hotels and motels during your investigation that you did for the Toronto Star. Take me inside one of them. What's it like?
Well, we went to mostly kind of the lower kind of sleazy motels, as you were just talking about, along the 401 when we initially started looking into sex trafficking, and we wanted to see if we could actually find it. So down some of these, in these motels, you know, it's dark and there's not a lot of people around at night. And often there are men standing outside doors, just chain smoking or waiting around, looking through the curtains, seeing what's going on inside the room, but not actually stepping inside. So that led us to think that maybe they were traffickers or pimps waiting for their girl who had a client at the time. You also can see men coming into these motels in really flash, expensive cars, doing laps of the parking lot and then pulling up and waiting, and a young girl gets out and goes inside a room, and these men sit in the car on iPads and are watching movies while they wait for her. We went to one motel in Mississauga during the investigation, and it was very blatant that we could see sex trafficking. We saw a young woman go into a motel room, and then we saw an airport limousine driver pull into the car park and kind of look around and see who was watching him. And then he walked up and knocked on her door, went into her room, and we timed it. Exactly half an hour later, he came out. And then 5 minutes later, another man pulled into the car park, went into the same room, knocked on the door, went inside, and exactly half an hour later, he too came out. So it just became very blatant in just the few nights that we went out that this is happening all around us. And the victims I spoke to also mentioned the higher end hotels like the Sheraton, the Hilton in downtown Toronto as well.
Here's Olivia explaining, you know, she in her work shows up there as an observer, can see what's going on. And this is a crime that's happening somewhat in the open. I mean, how do these girls get to these car parks? Someone drives them. So presumably a taxi driver, the people who clean hotel rooms, the people that work at hotel rooms. How come, I don't know if this is the right word, are these people also complicit in what's going on? That's probably the wrong word, but yeah. Are they turning a blind eye?
No, I wouldn't use that. In actual fact, it's interesting you bring that point up, because when I first got brought in to start the unit up in Halton, I realised there was a huge gap in the education and knowledge base of a lot of these individuals. And so what we did in Halton was we actually carried out in 2013, it would have been now, hotel training to highlight signs of human trafficking to hoteliers. And I actually said to all of my hoteliers that have hotels in our region, I don't want you to send your general manager. I want you to send your cleaning staff. I want you to send your maintenance staff. I want you to send your front of house staff. That's who I want to see at this training, because that's who we need to educate. We have a fantastic relationship with hoteliers within the region, generally across the board, and they provide us with a lot of information, a lot of intelligence in relation to the comings and goings that are there. And so from my perspective, in our region, we certainly have bridged the gap so that these people can be our eyes and ears. In law enforcement, we're only a small piece of the machine, a small cog in the machine, and we have to engage in our community, and we've been doing that.
What are you telling them to look out for?
Just the signs of, someone booking a room and then in actual fact you never see that individual. You see a female, comings and goings, frequent comings and goings from a room. Someone who doesn't have any identification, someone who's looking to the male in the supposed relationship for guidance with everything. Someone who's not able to answer questions. Someone who maybe looks bruised, looks in a state of disarray. A young girl turning up with multiple suitcases, because a lot of the time these girls are just transported from hotel to hotel throughout the country, not just the province, and that is their life in that suitcase. So things like that, and then the whole do not disturb sign being in the door of the hotel room throughout the guest stay. It's unusual, right?
Yeah, it's also very common for them to ask for towels multiple times throughout the day.
Asking for towels.
They're asking their clients to shower before they engage in sexual activity with them, and they're also showering multiple times. So things like this, if cleaning staff could be aware of simple things like this, it would also really help them understand the phenomenon of what domestic human trafficking looks like.
Susan Harada, you were a reporter, a TV reporter, what, in the 80s and 90s? Is that when that was for CBC?
That's right.
Okay. Now you're on the other side, your perch is teaching, younger people who want to become journalists. I bet a lot of them say to you, Susan, I want to be a journalist. And I bet sometimes you think, why? In the sense that look at the changing media landscape, and it's such a difficult thing. Now, we've made the point that advertising revenue is part of the problem, technology disruptors part of the problems, but why are so many people turning away from newspapers, local television, local radio?
Well, I think that, first of all, I don't wonder why they want to be journalists. I think that they come in with very firm ideas about what they want to do, and I think, good on them. We will always have a need for journalists and for journalism. And I think also keep in mind that you need to separate what's happening with the newspaper industry and what's happening with journalism, news, and information. I don't think that people are turning away from journalism and information. They're turning to different sources of it. So they're going somewhere else to get their news and information, but they're still getting it. So that's what polls have shown, that yes, newspaper readership is down, but over here, especially with the younger demographic, the consumption of news and information through mobile, for example, is growing. So there is that to balance off and to keep in mind.
Okay. I don't know if we can do a show of hands here, but who here is lamenting the death of the newspaper, the traditional newspaper? Chip's lamenting it. Anyone else? Susan, Marcy, okay. Mm-hmm. Chip, are you lamenting the death of the newspaper because of nostalgia? Why are you lamenting it?
I'm lamenting the loss of the traditional newspapers because the newspapers traditionally have been they've been very good at holding elected officials to account. They've been very good at taking the extra step and digging into the background, and they have the backup of experienced editors, and they use lawyers as necessary in order to push the limits, how far they can go. And I don't see that happening in some of the new forms of media. They are on a shoestring, some of them. The experience of the people in them is limited, and they maybe as time goes on they will improve. But I'm lamenting the loss of serious journalism, which I attribute to, which I connect with newspapers.
Okay, Marcy, well, I'm going to come to the people that probably disagree with what Chip has just said in a moment. I can see Jeff smiling there, but Marcy, what are you lamenting about the loss of newspapers?
Well, we have an elder population who may not be online and get the news that they're looking for. So for the last 3 years, it's been very difficult to get to that population of ours. I mean, we have the largest education self-government agreement that we're ratifying this year with Canada. And we really need to get that information out to all our citizens. So I know we're missing a part of the population without having that print.
Okay, so you're missing outreach. You're not getting to everyone that you want your news to get to.
No, we're getting to like 110 countries, but we're not necessarily getting to all our citizens.
Okay. Susan Harada, what are you lamenting about the loss of newspapers in the traditional sense?
Well, what I'm lamenting is the fact that that's where we came from. This is what the news industry was built on. This is what journalism was built on. Back in the early 20th century, for example, we had 138 dailies. We had 138 owners of those dailies. But things have shifted over the years. Of course, radio came along, television came along. Now we have this new thing. So while I'm lamenting the newspaper, the hard copy newspaper that I'm used to sitting down with my cup of coffee, I still don't think it means that this is the death knell for journalism. I think we face into the future. I think there are all kinds of exciting things going on. And I don't know if you want to raise this right now, but I would take exception with the remark that that's where the serious journalism is. There is serious journalism that's has been done on radio and on television, that has certainly been done online and in new forms. You just look at some of the new forms of news and information in Canada. We've got iPolitics, we've got The Type, we've got Blacklock's Reporter, we've got in the US ProPublica. Things are still being done, and it's still serious journalism.
All right, Jeff Algie, when Chip Martin said he's lamenting the loss of serious journalism, about a well-resourced newsroom, about people paid well, what was going through your head? Because I'm thinking you're probably disagreeing with Chip.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think, no one likes to see a business fail, and no one wants to see news fail. I think if we talked about lamenting the loss of news, it'd be different than saying the loss of newspapers. Again, we see that the audience has changed. People have changed. They consume news in different ways. But if you look at what we're doing, and we've been doing this now for 16 years, although it's escalated quite quickly over the last 2.5, we're hiring professional journalists. We're staffing newsrooms. In Sault Ste. Marie, our flagship site, we have the largest newsroom in the community. There's 12 people in a relatively small community in a newsroom for an all-digital site. It takes time. This business model has shifted extremely quickly, but I don't think we're losing professional journalism. We're hiring these people. We launched Guelph last week. We hired 2 of the Guelph Mercury reporters. We have 5 of their freelancers on board. The newspaper, like the stone tablet, it's times have changed, but we don't have to lose good quality journalism with it.
I want to start by just putting out one key fact from the Open Forum Infectious Diseases study that was just published, and it said that of 514 healthcare workers surveyed, 25% said it was ethical to refuse to provide care for Ebola patients. 25%. Dr. Karen Landman, to you first. What do you make of that number?
In some ways it's surprising, Steve, and in some ways it's not. The Hippocratic Oath is one that doctors take, and many healthcare providers have sort of the same commitment to caring for their patients. But when something scary like this threatens people and their families, people's commitment tends to go inward and to number one and to the people around them. So, we saw some trends like this during the HIV epidemic with people refusing to care for patients in hospital or in healthcare facilities. So in that sense, it's not so much a surprise. But the number of people, being a quarter of people, being pretty similar to the number who would have refused during the HIV epidemic, I would have thought that would be a little bit lower now with what we know about universal precautions and our ability to protect ourselves from the spread of disease.
Dr. Susie Hota, were you surprised to see that number?
Again, not entirely surprised. At a time of crisis, I think, and when something becomes a reality, it's like our primitive brains take over, and suddenly the thought of, potentially infecting people around you that you love and you care for really takes over. And so I have to say I'm not that surprised by the number.
Karen, what might healthcare workers believe is the ethical reason why they don't have to do their jobs?
In this study, the lead author, Dr. Deepa Narasimhulu and her colleagues found that 90% of the folks who felt it was ethical to refuse care were most concerned about their family's well-being. It's kind of a surprise because, we know that Ebola isn't transmissible if people don't have symptoms, but still that, I think, drove many people's refusal or thinking that it was ethical to refuse. I think a lot of them also felt that they would not have access to disability insurance or short-term life insurance, and that their health care wouldn't be covered in the case that they were infected. And I think that the authors felt that that might have been a motivator toward that refusal.
Susie, are those reasonable concerns in your view?
I think they are. I really think that the thought of potentially spreading things to others when there is any element of unknown, and I think it's the unfamiliarity of this disease in our population that really kind of guides that. You may hear about how it's transmitted, but when you've not dealt with it before, I think that really drives people's reactions.
Karen, do you think it's indicative of a larger problem?
Yeah, I think people's training and education is in universal precautions, right? We learn that there are ways that we should be protecting ourselves from becoming infected from patients, whether we know they are infected, suspect they are infected, or not. But it doesn't, it seems to be overcome by fear during epidemic periods. And I think that indicates that our training is not so much in doing what's right during emergencies, but doing what's right when things are fine. So I think we could do better in educating and training healthcare workers to respond in a consistent way to people who need our care during emergency situations.
Susie, let me just pick your brains for a second on what you did when you were, I presume, part of the preparations here in the province of Ontario when the Ebola thing happened in West Africa, and you had to kind of prepare, right? You had to prepare Ontario for what if.
Right.
Did you take fears such as those we're talking about into account when you did your preparations?
Oh, absolutely. It was actually kind of one of the premises of our whole plan was involving the healthcare workers who would be seeing these patients and directly interacting with people and the system in that preparation. We actually tried to react to this quite quickly, and I think that gave us a bit of an advantage at our hospital. And we did become the designated site for repatriation of Canadian aid workers from West Africa during the epidemic with Ebola. So we had the time to really sort of think that through and recognize that making sure people felt safe was really the kind of the crux of it all. And we involved our frontline healthcare workers in a lot of the preparations, right down to the nitty-gritty of how you would draw blood from, a suspected case of Ebola to, what kinds of considerations would you have to take into play if a patient became agitated, if it was somebody who is being investigated for Ebola. And a lot of mock exercises to involve people in hands-on training. And I couldn't agree more with what Karen said about involving people and just making sure that you do this in between epidemic periods and when there's a little bit of calm, because you have to have them feeling comfortable with what the approach is going to be to react appropriately in the moment.
Well, you say in between epidemic periods, and this is not an academic exercise for some people who've been in healthcare for more than a decade, because we do remember 13 years ago, 44 people died from SARS.
Yes.
So presumably that informed your thinking on this as well?
Absolutely. And that was actually really quite critical in our early discussions with our staff, is comparing and contrasting what happened with SARS and Ebola. There was a lot of, I'd say, almost post-traumatic stress that's still in healthcare workers, and especially those who were involved directly with the patients during SARS and saw some of their colleagues fall ill. And it was a disease that disproportionately affected healthcare workers. So, we had to really do a lot of myth busting right up front, to the point where we were circulating, comparing and contrasting, Ebola and SARS as documents to frontline healthcare workers, addressing their concerns right off the bat.
What kinds of employees, what job sectors are we talking about?
I think we're talking about across the spectrum. What we've seen actually in Ontario is this shift in the labor market, where we used to have career pathways, and you could start in at the bottom in a lower skilled job and you'd move your way up to the top. Of course, there wasn't room for everyone at the top, but there was room to move up. And now we're seeing an increase in the bottom, an increase in the top, and those middle skilled jobs that used to provide the pathway are actually disappearing, and then that training isn't provided.
All right, so we have this gap. We all agree on that, right? That's what we're seeing out there. But David, then becomes the question, who's responsible for not the gap, but the training? Is it the business's responsibility? Is it the individual? Does it go to the outside?
I think it's an interesting part of the conversation in who's needs to step up. I mean, it's not government's problem to solve. It's not education's problem to solve. I mean, industry, I feel, needs to really play a major role in this, because education provides you the knowledge, the foundational knowledge, the theories, the principles. The on-the-job training gives you the skills we need to combine with that knowledge to really have you effective in the workplace and contributing to the bottom line, if you look at it that way. And we can't afford, I mean, technology is changing so rapid. We need employees that are flexible, as Jillian mentioned, that can continue lifelong learning, they need a foundation, a good foundation of skills. But also the fact that employers need to provide that on the job, the mentor, the experienced worker, introduce them to the new technologies. That happens on the job.
Okay, so employers' responsibility.
I really see employers need to play a bigger role.
Okay, Kaylee, what about the individual's responsibility?
I think the research that we've seen over time is that employees or individuals are taking on their responsibility. We are all getting more education. We've seen a tripling in the number of people who have a university education in the last 25 years. My generation, the millennial generation, is certainly doing everything that we're told, getting more skills, going to university, going to college, taking on unpaid internships, doing everything that we can to get a foothold in the labor market. And we're still told that we don't have enough experience. We're still told that we're just not quite the right fit. And if we had a little bit more training on the job and a little bit more commitment from employers to invest in us, then we might find that those pathways were open.
I'm going to put you on the spot, speak for a generation. When you say to the employer, listen, I'm willing to be trained up, provide that training, what are the general responses people get?
I think it depends what industry you're in, and certainly every individual has a different experience. My experience over the past few years has been really quite excellent. I've had some great training from different employers. At the same time, a lot of my peers and other people who I graduated with have not had that same experience, and I think we all have developed our resumes to compete in a labor market, and then there's a sense of getting lucky in the end for who gets those good jobs where there is investment in the individual from the employer side after that.
Well, and I think if I may pick up on that, I think the luck of the draw is really what we're worrying about. If we've got 40% of the Canadian population that struggles with reading, problem solving, numeracy skills, and they don't find themselves in a place of employment where they invest in training. We have this kind of mortarboard attitude in the 21st century and in developed countries where you finish college, university, or even high school, and we think we're good for life. But with the rapidity of change in the 21st century and the fact that so much technological change means that we've got to keep up with our digital skills, if you don't land in a workplace where they're investing in it, it's very difficult to take time out to go back to school if you're raising a family, putting kids through school, or even looking after yourself in the 21st century. And we haven't developed an education system to really look after adults
Let me ask you about that, because you do see this through the prism of literacy, which goes in the camp of education. And David says, employers need to take more responsibility. Yes. Kaylee's saying the individuals are doing, what we can. Where are you on the education side?
So I think that there is only so much that you can be taught in formal education. So each of us around this table have probably been fortunate enough to go to college or university or maybe beyond. However, if you haven't, or if you did it a number of years ago, if you graduated 15 years ago or 20 years ago and you're working on the line and you're a skilled tradesperson and you're doing excellent work somewhere, and then you lose your job, and then you go out to look for another job, and you haven't had an opportunity to develop your communication skills or your critical thinking skills or whatever, what do you do at that point? We don't have a formal education system, Pia, for people after they leave high school, university, or college. And those are also very structured learning environments where you've got to start in September or start in January or start in May and follow a certain regimen that's already set up. What we're aware of in the literacy sector is there are all these adult education specialists who are literacy and essential skills practitioners. There's a whole cadre of them champing at the bit to get into a lot of workplaces and offer the literacy and essential skills training alongside of new production processes or new workplace safety process training or whatever is necessary. So there's a real opportunity to do more on-site, on-the-spot training in-site for that employers can purchase.
I think to build on that is education and training, skills training, on-the-job skills training is not linear. I mean, I think it goes back to the academia conversation around too often we influence youth to pursue post-secondary education at a college or university level, which is important. I mean, the reality is that your certification in your first profession is a stepping stone to your next. And I think as employers, what we need to understand is where do your future leaders come from? Where do your future managers and that come from? Can start with your entry-level people if you continue to invest in them. to hire a university grad and drop them into a leadership role in manufacturing, I mean, it creates gaps, and there's a whole lot of opportunity that we're missing by having our boots on the ground and growing up with your industry. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. This is not linear, and academia doesn't just end and you're good for life. It's lifelong learning.
I had lunch with the creator of the Oscars So White hashtag, April Rain, and a few other activists from the Toronto area. And we were just celebrating like how black media has gotten. Like everyone is really starting to pay attention to not just our history, not just the civil rights chapter, but what's happening right now, which I believe currently we're undergoing an important era in civil rights. People, our children and grandchildren will be talking about this period in time. And the conversations we're having with each other are not the same as what we're having with white folks, unfortunately.
Okay, let me push.
Like
let me suggest these things to you. They're not coming
from
from me. I'm just suggesting because they're out there in the world, right? What does Beyonce got to do with being a black Canadian? What does Black Lives Matter, an American hashtag? What does police officers being accused of shooting young black men have to do with you being a black Canadian in your experience?
Well, what it has to do with me is that somebody who's distantly related to me was shot down by police in Peel. What it has to do with me is that if I was to have a conversation with the family of Andrew Loku and ask them, well, what does Black Lives Matter have to do with Toronto? They would probably have a few words to say to you. The thing is, in Canada, we like to think that we're past the United States because at least we're not killing people. At least we don't have police shooting people down in the streets, except when they do. At least we don't have people being discriminated against and being kept out of jobs, except when they are. At least we don't have people like spitting on black people in the streets, except when that happened to my best friend just a couple of years ago. And the person who spit in his face called him the N-word. This stuff happens here. But beyond that, beyond the overt acts of racism, there's the fact that if we look at our political structure, look at our parliament, look at Toronto City Council, look at our provincial. Well, look at our provincial parliament. I was getting to that. Thank you. Yeah. Look at our judiciary. Look at our law enforcement. Black people are erased from every position of leadership that there pretty much is in this province and just about in this country. We are far underrepresented. We're overrepresented in prisons, but no one cares about that. Black youth make up 41% of children inside of the care of Children's Aid Society. No one really cares about that. Nobody really wants to talk about that. But the moment that we say, well, give us a little bit of a space inside of our judiciary, law enforcement, inside of our government, inside of business leadership, and all of a sudden it's like we're trying to push into places that we're not wanted. So Black History Month is important not just for talking about the contributions that we have made, but talking about the contributions that we can make to this country, but we're not allowed to do so because of systemic racism.
All right, Sylvia, throwing this one at you because, again, I see parallels within the Indigenous experience in histories that I think you probably agree with a lot. You said that your history is also being excluded, and I know you've heard this before. Let me throw it out there. That's not my history. Why do I need to learn about your history, Sylvia or Andre?
Well, the simple answer for me, particularly when our young people are talking to me about it, is that our creation story says we were created here, but that other peoples and other races were created other places. The word we most use in our own language talks about being natural people. It doesn't talk about being a black or red or white or yellow or brown or where you were born. And so it seems to me that the ultimate expression of peace in all of our relationships is because we have to talk about these things.
This is our shared history.
This is our shared history.
Our shared history, I agree. That's a much more polite route than I would have taken to answer
Off
that.
You go, Supriya.
I mean, well, to be honest, of course it's our history. How is it not our history? We're all Canadian, and whoever, helped shape the country that we now live in and where we are is a part of that history, whether or not it's Indigenous or Black or white. And the fact that we only learn about, Eurocentric, and in my case, in Quebec, it's Québécois de souche, which is like, pure... Pure land Quebecers is how we say it in French. I don't know what the translation is. Pure wool, I guess. Yeah.
White. You can just say white.
Yeah. I mean, it's very galling, and I mean, it's insulting, and it's offensive, and the fact that we still have to have these sorts of conversations in 2016, and we don't have properly integrated curriculum, I think we should all be ashamed.
It's a point in time for us to make history, not just for us to reflect on history. I think the notion of Black pride has been so pressed out of Black people for so long. And I think it's now becoming acceptable for us to say, I'm Black and I'm proud. That's becoming a thing again. The thing about blackness that's hard for me to express, and I think hard for a lot of other people to express, almost everything that North America has, as far as its culture goes, was in some way, shape, or form drawn out of blackness.
Absolutely.
If we talk about our music, if we talk about our pop culture, even our internet, I mean, black people make Twitter awesome, don't we? The thing, and I think it's now become okay for us to sit back and settle in ourselves and be like, no, I really am happy with who I am. I'm proud of myself and I'm proud of my people. We used to have to minimize our blackness. For me to be able to get to where I am at work, for me to be able to move, to get by day to day, I almost have to shrink into myself and not allow my black maleness to be offensive or intimidating to somebody else. Now we're getting to a point where I can just walk around with my shoulders back and my chin up and be proud of myself, and I'm really happy for that.
So you're saying black is the new black?
Black is the new black, that's right.
All right.
What about this idea that we're letting, we do it for a month and then we all go on with our merry ways and don't pay any attention to this anymore?
I'm all about celebration. I get it. I think there are safe ways for people to come together and have difficult conversations. So I believe it should permeate all of this education, all of this change in attitude should permeate everything we do. But I'm fine for a celebration, so do them all.
I think one thing that we really ought to get out of this month is pride and knowledge of self. And the second thing is trying to create history, not just looking back at people and saying, hey, they were great and they had a huge contribution, but for black people in North America to look at themselves and say, what can I contribute to the society? What story do I want to be told about me? What is my legacy? I think in the time that you have left in Black History Month is to uplift people who are trying to do the work right now and help them get to where they need to get to.
The Ontario government announced late last year that it will no longer place new workers in provincially funded sheltered workshops. Here for more are Pamela Cushing, founder and director of the Disability Studies program at King's University College at Western University, Michael Bach, executive vice president of the Canadian Association for Community Living, and Donald Goose-Sala, a developmental services worker. Hello to all three of you. Thank you for being here. Let's just start with the province makes a decision late last year. No more of these things. What do you think of it? What do you think of the decision, Donald?
Well, I think there are changes that need to be made to the programs. They certainly could use modernization, but I think in terms of the changes that need to be made, we need to take a step back, take a deep breath, and look at collaboration between various levels of government and agencies to make sure the changes that are made are progressive. We're not talking about a population that presents a unified front where all individuals are in the same situation and require the same approach. There are a lot of individual differences that need to be considered, and what works for some might not work for others. So, for instance, bringing people into a community workplace is obviously going to be the goal for everybody, but there are going to be people that we support, people with disabilities, that are either unable to get into the community workforce for various reasons, or they might not want to work in the community workforce. I know some of the people I work with, I've been running a community employment initiative to try and secure and facilitate community employment for the people I work with. And one of the candidates that I spoke to, because I interview them before we actually go through the process, what came out of that interview is that she actually didn't want to work in the community. She was much happier working in her vocational program with her peers there because that's where she was comfortable. That doesn't mean that in the future there cannot be a change in her attitude or that she cannot be brought into the community workforce, but for a population that has trouble speaking up for itself, we can't tell them that we're going to make these changes to your life because we think that it's going to improve your quality of life without considering what their opinion on the matter is.
Okay, we'll get more into all of that in a sec. But the province's decision, Michael, a good one, a bad one?
Oh, I think it's an excellent decision. It's long overdue. I certainly agree. How this gets executed is really the question. But the fact that we've got thousands of people in this province working in sheltered workshops and day programs for far below minimum wage, I think has just been disgraceful. So I just hope I'm pleased the provincial government's finally taken this leadership. And I agree, we've got to bring the stakeholders together and figure out a plan to make this work for everybody.
Where are you on this? Was that a good decision, saying no more, not in this province?
I think sort of in between the two of them, it is a good decision to make some evolution of these programs, but to shut them all would be making the same mistake we made during part of the deinstitutionalization period in the 60s and 70s, where we sort of scandalized, again, a journalistic exposés by Pierre Burton and others and said, well, let's just shut them all down. But the government hadn't done two other pieces. One, they hadn't figured out where are they going to go instead. And number two, a piece that continues to be missing today is they didn't figure figure out enough. What are we going to do about the negative public attitudes that, as Donald was saying, create an unwelcoming environment for people in workplaces and other recreational settings? So I think that public attitude change piece continues to be neglected.
I got to be honest with you, I hadn't heard about sheltered workshops till a little. Where did these start? How did they start?
Well, they started largely by parents who had sons and daughters with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, back as early late 40s and into the 50s, because the assumption was that, first of all, their children wouldn't be going to school. In fact, the Education Act precluded that. And then as people came to the end of the special schools that parents created, the question was, well, now what? And there wasn't, to Pam's point, there wasn't the public sort of attitudes that people would have a place in the regular labor market. So we had to create an alternative, which was sheltered workshops. But as early actually as the late 40s, there was a provision in the Employment Standards Act that provided for training of people with handicaps could be excluded from employment standards. That was then changed in the mid 1980s because sheltered workshops were found to be in violation of the employment standards because they were paying people far below minimum wage. So they changed the exclusion to say, well, as long as it's for the benefit of the individual, it's okay. So we've got a situation where there's long been a recognition of the problem of this, so much so that we've had to exclude this explicitly from the Employment Standards Act. And so, I think it's really time to make this shift. So they've been around for a very long time.
First time they've come under fire to this extent, or
they've come out
as we've adapted and changed our views and education about inclusion. It kind of sounds like these were born out of a time that was from a time that was different than we live in now.
Yeah, exactly.
But the myth that we have to be really careful about is that if we shut them down, there will be beautiful other jobs for people to go to, and that's the myth that we have to be careful about. Absolutely. And I think that the expose in the Star was too one-sided about, because it pretends that there is a welcoming community and welcoming employers for people to go to, which refers to your point earlier about what is the government doing to create these incentives. So the idea that they could find really interesting, meaningful work out in the community is a great regulative ideal to work towards. But if we just shut things down without putting financial resources in place and tax incentives for businesses, the reality is people like Donald and Joe, who you had on before, are doing this work all the time and coming up against a lot of barriers.
That is the Agenda's Week in Review, and you can see all of those programs in their entirety at tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.